Welcome back to Fearless in Faith. I'm Esther, and I'm so excited to have you join us for another powerful episode. If you're new here, this is the space where we dive into incredible stories of unwavering faith, bold decisions, and the undeniable power of God in our lives. First, a big thank you to all of you who tuned in last week. The response to episode 5, where we talked about overcoming fear through prayer, has been truly overwhelming. Your messages, emails, and comments have been such an encouragement to us. It's amazing to see how God is using this podcast to inspire and strengthen so many of you. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode yet, make sure you go back and catch up. It's one you don't want to miss. And now let's dive into this week's episode. Friends, have you ever felt God calling you to step out of your comfort zone? To leave behind everything safe and familiar and walk a path that feels uncertain, even risky? If you have, then you know it's not easy. But here's the good news: God's faithfulness always meets us where our faith takes us. Today's episode is titled Living Fearlessly, a testimony of courage and bold faith, and our guest is someone who embodies that title perfectly. Pastor Jonathan Blake is with us today, and his story will absolutely inspire you. Pastor Jonathan took a leap of faith that most of us can only imagine. He left behind a secure corporate job to plant a church in a region where Christians face intense persecution. His journey is one of obedience, courage, and incredible trust in God. You'll hear about how he faced fear head-on, how he witnessed miraculous protection, and how God's faithfulness carried him through every challenge. So grab your coffee or tea, find a quiet spot, and get ready for a conversation that just might challenge you to live fearlessly for God. Let's welcome Pastor Jonathan Blake to Fearless in Faith. Pastor Jonathan, it's such an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Esther. It's a joy to be here and to share how God has moved in my life.
Let's start at the beginning, Pastor Jonathan. You were in a stable, high-paying corporate job. What prompted you to leave that life behind and step into something as uncertain and challenging as church planting?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my story. I often describe my journey as one of stepping out of the boat, much like Peter walking on water. It wasn't easy, but every step brought me closer to God's purpose for my life. Let me start with where I was before this journey began. I worked as a senior executive for a multinational corporation, managing a high-performing team. I had everything the world defines as success: a six-figure salary, a beautiful home, and the respect of my peers. But despite all of that, I felt a void. I knew I was created for something more. This stirring grew stronger during a mission trip to a persecuted region where I witnessed believers worshiping in secret. These were people with so little in terms of material wealth, yet their faith was unshakable. They risked everything, their homes, their freedom, even their lives, to follow Jesus. One night during that trip, I was praying and asking God why I felt so restless despite all my earthly accomplishments. That's when I sensed his voice so clearly in my spirit. He said, "I have prepared you for this. Go and make my name known in this place." It wasn't an audible voice, but it was undeniable. The clarity was overwhelming. I returned home knowing my life was about to change forever. Obeying that call was not easy. I wrestled with God for weeks. I questioned whether I had heard him correctly. What about my family? What about our financial security? What about my comfortable life? I remember pouring out my fears to my wife one evening. To my surprise, she said, "If God is calling you to this, he will equip us for the journey. I'd rather be in his will in a dangerous place than out of his will in comfort." Her faith strengthened mine, so with trembling hands but a resolute heart, I resigned from my corporate job. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind, but deep down I knew I was finally stepping into the purpose God had for me. When we arrived in the region, the reality of what we were stepping into hit us hard. This was not just a spiritually barren place, but also a hostile one. People were suspicious of outsiders, especially Christians. The local authorities kept a close eye on us, and we faced open hostility from certain groups. One day, a group of men showed up at our makeshift church and threatened to harm us if we didn't stop meeting. My initial reaction was fear for my family, fear for the people we were ministering to. But that night, we gathered for an all-night prayer meeting. We cried out to God, not just for protection, but for boldness to continue his work. The next morning, one of the men who had threatened us came back, but this time he looked different, almost contrite. He told us he couldn't sleep the entire night because he felt convicted. That man is now one of the most faithful members of our church. Time and again, God showed up in miraculous ways. There was one instance when we were trying to deliver Bibles to a remote village. The roads were heavily monitored and we didn't know how we would get past the checkpoints. We prayed for wisdom, and out of nowhere a local farmer approached us. He offered to help us transport the Bibles hidden under a load of hay on his cart. We trusted God and went ahead with the plan. At each checkpoint, the guards inspected the cart but never found the Bibles. I have no doubt that God blinded their eyes to what they were looking for. The Bibles reached the village safely, and the Word of God brought revival to that community. To this day, I marvel at how God uses ordinary people in situations to accomplish extraordinary things.
Pastor Jonathan, your story is so inspiring for our listeners who might feel called to take bold steps of faith but are held back by fear. What would you say to them?
I'd say this: obedience to God might cost you something, but it's worth everything. Fear is natural, but it doesn't have to define you. Take it to God and let His promises anchor your soul. Remember, He equips the called. You don't have to see the whole path. Just take the first step in faith and surround yourself with a community of believers who can pray with you and encourage you.
Such wise words. I'm reminded of 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Pastor Jonathan, thank you for being a living testimony of that truth.
Thank you, Esther. God bless everyone listening.
What an incredible testimony of courage, faith, and God's unfailing presence. Pastor Jonathan's journey reminds us that stepping out in obedience to God isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. If you're listening today and feel a stirring in your heart, maybe God is calling you to take a bold step of faith too. It could be something big, like a career change, or something smaller but equally significant, like sharing the gospel with someone in your life. Whatever it is, remember that God equips the called. You don't have to do it alone. He promises to go before you, walk beside you, and carry you when you need it most. Let Pastor Jonathan's story be a reminder that fear doesn't have the final word. Faith does, as he said so beautifully. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's obedience despite fear. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Fearless in Faith. If Pastor Jonathan's story has inspired you, please share this episode with someone who might need encouragement. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story of God's faithfulness. Until next time, keep walking in faith, living boldly, and trusting that God is always with you. I'm Esther, and this is Fearless in Faith. Stay fearless and God bless.